The gunshot echoed across the dusty plains of Montana Territory, 1876, as Hank Hartwell watched the last of the rustlers fall dead in the crimson light of dusk. His Winchester still smoked in his weathered hands, but his blue eyes reflected nothing, no satisfaction, no remorse, just emptiness that had settled in his soul 3 years prior when he'd returned from a cattle drive to find his homestead in ashes and his young wife and infant son buried in shallow graves. "That's the last of 'em, boss," said Will, his ranch foreman, holstering his Colt revolver. "Marshall'll want a report." Hank nodded, his expression unchanging beneath the shadow of his worn Stetson. At 32, he was still young, but the hard lines etched into his sun-bronzed face and the silver threading through his dark hair at the temples told of a man who'd lived several lifetimes of grief. "Send word to Buford. I'll meet him tomorrow," Hank replied, his voice rough from disuse. He rarely spoke more than necessary these days. Words were hollow things that changed nothing. The Double H Ranch had prospered under Hank's single-minded dedication, growing from a modest homestead to one of the largest operations in the territory. But its success brought him no joy. It was merely something to fill the emptiness of days that stretched before him like the endless Montana prairie. He mounted his Mustang and rode ahead of his men, preferring solitude to conversation. The setting sun cast long shadows across the rolling grasslands, painting the world in shades of gold and amber. Once, he might have found beauty in such a sight. Now, it was merely a signal that another day had passed. The ranch house loomed ahead, a sturdy 2-story structure of timber and stone that he'd built with his own hands after the fire. It was larger than he needed, with rooms that remained empty and untouched. Sometimes, in the deep of night, he imagined he could hear Sarah's laughter echoing through the halls, or the faint cry of his son Jacob. But those were just ghosts, and Hank had long since stopped believing in anything he couldn't touch or see. As he approached the hitching post, a commotion near the bunkhouse caught his attention. His ranch hands were gathered around something or someone, their voices raised in a mixture of concern and curiosity. Hank frowned, nudging his horse toward the crowd. "What's going on here?" he demanded, and the men parted to reveal a woman slumped against the water trough. Her dress was torn and dirt-stained, her honey-blonde hair falling in tangled waves around a face that might have been pretty if not for the bruise blooming along her right cheekbone. She looked up at him with defiant green eyes that sparked with life even in her exhaustion. "Found her wandering about a mile out, boss," explained Tom, one of the younger cowhands. "Says her stagecoach was robbed and the driver killed. She walked the rest of the way." Hank dismounted slowly, studying the stranger. "What's your name, miss?" "Abigail Zimmerman," she replied, her voice surprisingly steady despite her condition. "I was on my way to Silver Creek to take a teaching position." "Silver Creek's still 20 miles west," Hank said flatly. "I'm aware of that, mister." "Hartwell, this is my ranch." She attempted to stand, wincing as she put weight on her right ankle. "If you could spare a horse, Mr. Hartwell, I'll be on my way and trouble you no further." Something about her proud bearing despite her obvious distress tugged at a corner of Hank's mind that he thought had died years ago. He pushed the feeling aside. "You're not riding anywhere tonight, Miss Zimmerman. Not with that ankle and not with bandits still possibly out there." He turned to his foreman. "Will, have Mrs. Peterson prepare the guest room, and send for Doc Gardner first thing tomorrow." Abigail stiffened. "That's not necessary. I'm perfectly—" "Mrs. B. Peterson is our housekeeper," Hank interrupted. "You'll stay the night, see the doctor in the morning, and we'll arrange for you to reach Silver Creek when you're fit to travel." He didn't wait for her response, already turning back to his horse. He felt her eyes on him assessing, curious, and it made him uncomfortable in a way he hadn't felt in years. He'd grown accustomed to people avoiding his gaze, intimidated by the hardness they found there. "Thank you," she called after him, the words simple but sincere. Hank paused, then nodded once without looking back. He led his horse to the stable, taking more time than necessary with the evening routine of unsaddling, brushing down, and feeding. By the time he entered the main house, he hoped the woman would be settled in her room and he could retreat to his study with a glass of whiskey. No such luck. Abigail Zimmerman sat at his kitchen table, her ankle propped on a stool with a cold compress wrapped around it. Mrs. Peterson, the matronly housekeeper who had been with Hank since he rebuilt the ranch, was setting out a plate of food and chattering away like she hadn't had someone new to talk to in months, which, Hank realized, she probably hadn't. "There you are, Mr. Hartwell," Mrs. Peterson said brightly. "I was just telling Miss Zimmerman about how you single-handedly built this place up after—" She stopped abruptly, remembering too late that Hank never spoke of the past. "After I purchased the land," Hank finished smoothly, though his eyes warned the housekeeper against further reminiscences. Abigail glanced between them, clearly sensing the undercurrent but too polite to pry. "You've built something impressive here, Mr. Hartwell. Mrs. Peterson was explaining that you run over 2,000 head of cattle." 2,500, he corrected, pouring himself a cup of coffee instead of the whiskey he craved. "You said you're to be a teacher?" She nodded, her face brightening. "Yes. Silver Creek has finally raised enough funds to build a proper schoolhouse. I answered their advertisement in the Eastern papers." "You're from the East?" Hank asked, noting her refined speech and the delicate way she handled her cutlery despite her obvious hunger. "Boston," she confirmed. "I taught at a girls' academy there for 3 years after completing my own education." "Quite a change, coming to Montana Territory." A shadow crossed her face. "Sometimes change is necessary, Mr. Hartwell." Something in her tone suggested there was more to her story than a simple desire for adventure, but Hank didn't press. Everyone had their secrets, their reasons for seeking the frontier. His own reasons were buried 6 feet under the old oak tree behind the house. Mrs. Peterson bustled around, filling the silence with cheerful domestic noise until she placed a plate before Hank as well. "Eat," she commanded, one of the few people who dared to give him orders. "You're getting too thin again." Hank dutifully took a bite of the stew, though he barely tasted it. Food, like most things, had lost its savor for him. He was aware of Abigail watching him with those observant green eyes and found himself sitting straighter, as if her scrutiny demanded some response from him. "Tell me about these bandits," he said, steering the conversation to practical matters. "How many were there? Did you get a look at any of them?" "3 men," she replied, setting down her fork. "They stopped the coach about 10 miles east of here. I didn't see their faces clearly, they wore bandanas, but one had a distinctive scar across his hand, and another spoke with what sounded like a southern accent." Hank frowned. The description matched reports of a gang that had been terrorizing the area for months. "And the driver?" Her eyes darkened with sorrow. "Shot when he tried to protect the strongbox. There was another passenger, an elderly gentleman who they roughed up pretty badly, but he was still alive when I left to find help." "You left him there?" Hank asked sharply. "He insisted," Abigail said, defensive now. "Mr. Finch said he couldn't walk that far, and someone needed to get word to the authorities. The bandits took the horses, so I had no choice but to go on foot." Hank stood abruptly. "Will!" he called, and moments later his foreman appeared at the kitchen door. "Get 3 men and ride out east along the stage road. There's an injured passenger out there with a dead driver." Will nodded and disappeared to carry out the orders. Hank turned back to Abigail, who was watching him with an expression of relief and gratitude that made him uncomfortable. "They'll find him," he said gruffly. "You should rest now." "Thank you," she said again, and there was a warmth in her voice that made something stir in the wasteland of his chest, something he quickly stamped out. "Mrs. Peterson will show you to your room," he muttered, and left without another word. Later that night, Hank sat in his darkened study, a glass of whiskey untouched on the desk before him as he stared out the window at the star-filled Montana sky. The house was quiet, but he was acutely aware of the stranger sleeping under his roof, her presence disturbing the carefully constructed emptiness of his life, like a stone dropped into still water. He told himself it was simply the disruption to his routine, the responsibility of a vulnerable woman in his care. Once the doctor had seen to her ankle and arrangements were made to transport her to Silver Creek, things would return to normal. He would return to normal, to the numbing rhythm of work and solitude that had carried him through the past 3 years. But as he finally drained his whiskey and headed upstairs to his own room, he caught a glimpse of the door to the guest room and found himself wondering what dreams might visit Abigail Zimmerman in the night. And for the first time in a very long time, Hank Hartwell felt something other than nothing, a faint flicker of curiosity that troubled him more than he cared to admit. Morning came with the first pale light of dawn filtering through the curtains of Abigail's room. She woke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where she was until the ache in her ankle and the unfamiliar surroundings brought yesterday's events rushing back. The stagecoach, the robbery, poor Mr. Jones. The driver slumped over with blood staining his shirt. The long, painful walk through the rangeland. And finally, the stern-faced rancher with the dead eyes. Abigail sat up slowly, testing her ankle. It was still swollen but less painful than the night before. A basin of fresh water had been placed on the dresser along with a clean towel. Her tattered dress had been taken away, replaced by a simple cotton garment that must have belonged to Mrs. Peterson, though it hung loosely on her slender frame. After washing her face and arranging her hair as best she could, Abigail made her way carefully downstairs. The house was quiet except for sounds coming from the kitchen. She found Mrs. Peterson kneading bread dough, her plump, capable hands working with practiced efficiency. "Good morning, dear," the housekeeper said warmly. "Did you sleep well?" "Better than I expected," Abigail admitted. "Has there been any word about Mr. Finch?" Mrs. Peterson nodded, her expression sobering. "The men found him last night. He's at Doc Gardner's now. Roughed up pretty bad, but he'll pull through." Relief washed over Abigail. "And Mr. Jones? Was he brought back as well?" "Yes, poor soul. They'll bury him proper today." Mrs. Peterson gestured to a chair. "Sit and rest that ankle. Breakfast will be ready soon." Abigail complied, but her mind was racing. "I should speak to the marshal about what happened, and I need to get word to Silver Creek that I've been delayed." "Mr. Hartwell rode into town at first light to see the marshal," Mrs. Peterson informed her, sliding a cup of coffee across the table. "Doc Gardner will be by later to look at your ankle." "Mr. Hartwell seems very efficient," Abigail said carefully. Something like sadness crossed the housekeeper's face. "He's a good man. Just carrying a heavy burden." Abigail was about to ask more when the kitchen door swung open and Hank himself entered. He looked like he'd already put in half a day's work, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal tanned, muscular forearms, his dark hair slightly damp at the temples from exertion. He stopped short at the sight of Abigail, as if he'd forgotten she would be there. "Miss Zimmerman," he acknowledged with a nod. "How's the ankle?" "Improving, thank you," she replied. "Mrs. Peterson says you spoke to the marshal?" Hank poured himself coffee, his movements precise and economical. "Marshal Buford's organizing a posse to track the bandits. He'll want to speak with you later. Get your statement." He paused, studying her over the rim of his cup. "The man you left behind, Finch, he confirmed your account. Said you insisted on going for help despite the danger. That was brave." There was a note in his voice that might have been grudging admiration, and Abigail felt an unexpected flush of pleasure at the observation. "I did what was necessary," she said simply. Hank held her gaze a moment longer than necessary, then looked away. "Doc Gardner should be here by midday. Marshall sent a wire to Silver Creek explaining the situation. They're making arrangements for someone to come fetch you when you're able to travel. I appreciate all you've done, Mr. Hartwell. I won't impose on your hospitality any longer than necessary. Something flickered across his face so quickly she might have imagined it. It's no imposition, he said, then cleared his throat. I have work to attend to. Mrs. Bakker. Peterson will see to whatever you need. He left as abruptly as he'd arrived, leaving Abigail staring after him with a mixture of confusion and curiosity. There was something compelling about Hank Hartwell, not just his rugged good looks, which she couldn't help but notice despite her best intentions, but the contradiction between his gruff manner and his actions. A man who claimed to want solitude, yet had built a small empire that required him to lead others. A man who acted put out by her presence yet had ridden at dawn to report her attack and check on the welfare of a stranger. He wasn't always so. Mrs. Peterson hesitated, searching for the right word as she slid a plate of eggs and bacon in front of Abigail. Reserved? Abigail suggested diplomatically. Hard, Mrs. Peterson corrected with a sigh. There was a time when Hank Hartwell's laugh could be heard clear across the yard, when his eyes would light up at the sight of his wife and baby boy. Abigail's fork paused halfway to her mouth. He has a family? Mrs. Peterson's face crumpled. Had, she whispered. Sarah and little Jacob. It'll be 3 years next month since the fire that took them while Hank was away on a cattle drive. Terrible thing. By the time he got back. She shook her head, unable to continue. I'm so sorry, Abigail murmured, her heart aching at the thought of such loss. It explained so much about the man, the emptiness in his eyes, the way he held himself apart, the huge house with rooms that felt untouched. You remind me a bit of Sarah, Mrs. Peterson said thoughtfully. Not in looks. She was dark-haired, petite. But there's something about the way you carry yourself. Dignity, I suppose, and spirit. Abigail wasn't sure how to respond to that, so she focused on her breakfast, her mind filled with new understanding of her reluctant host. By the time she'd finished eating, she'd resolved to be as little trouble as possible during her stay. The last thing Hank Hartwell needed was a reminder of all he'd lost. But as the morning progressed, and she sat on the front porch with her ankle propped up, watching the activity of the ranch unfold before her, Abigail found herself drawn to the tall figure moving purposefully among the men, giving orders, inspecting equipment, occasionally demonstrating a technique with the calm assurance of someone who knew every aspect of his operation intimately. At one point, he glanced up and caught her watching. For a brief moment, their eyes locked across the distance, and Abigail felt a strange jolt of connection. Then he turned away, and the moment was gone, leaving her wondering if she'd imagined it. By noon, the doctor had arrived, a jovial, white-bearded man whose gentle hands belied his booming voice. Just a sprain, he pronounced after examining her ankle. Keep it elevated when you can, wrapped when you're moving about. Should be good as new in a week or so. He peered at the bruise on her face. And this? Any dizziness? Blurred vision? No, nothing like that, Abigail assured him. It's tender, but improving. Good, good. You're lucky, young lady. Stage robberies don't always end so well for the passengers. He packed his bag and accepted the cup of coffee Mrs. Peterson offered. Marshall says they've identified the gang based on your description. Same bunch that hit the billing stage last month. They'll catch up to them sooner or later. I hope so, Abigail said fervently. Poor Mr. Jones deserves justice. Indeed he does. Doc Gardner sipped his coffee, eyes twinkling over the rim. So you're to be Silver Creek's new schoolmarm? They've been waiting anxious like since Miss Pemberton ran off with that traveling salesman last spring. Abigail smiled despite herself. I hope I can live up to their expectations. I'm sure you will, the doctor said kindly. We need more education in these parts. Too many children growing up without proper learning. After the doctor left, Abigail found herself alone in the house. Mrs. Peterson had gone to the garden to gather vegetables for dinner, and the ranch hands were all busy with their tasks. The silence was peaceful after the commotion of the morning. Curious about the man whose home she was temporarily sharing, Abigail limped carefully through the main rooms. The house was well built and solidly furnished, but there was an impersonal quality to it, as if no one had bothered to make it truly a home. No personal mementos adorned the mantel. No books filled the shelves in the study except practical manuals on ranching and animal husbandry. She paused at the door to what appeared to be Hank's office, hesitating before her curiosity got the better of her. The room was as spartanly furnished as the rest of the house, with a large desk dominating the space. Papers were neatly stacked, ledgers carefully aligned. The only decoration was a framed photograph on the wall. Hank, looking years younger and almost unrecognizably happy, standing beside a pretty, dark-haired woman who held a blanket-wrapped bundle. Abigail's throat tightened at the sight. What must it be like to lose everything that mattered in a single moment? To return home expecting joy and find only ashes? That was taken 2 weeks before I left for the cattle drive. She whirled around, startled to find Hank standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable as he looked past her to the photograph. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I shouldn't have intruded." "You didn't," he said, though his voice was flat. "Doc Gardner says your ankle should heal clean." "Yes." He was very reassuring. Abigail took a step toward the door, but Hank remained blocking the way, his gaze now fixed on her face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "Why did you leave Boston, Miss Zimmerman?" The question caught her off guard. "I told you, I answered an advertisement." "There are schools in Boston," he interrupted, "established academies where a woman with your education would be valued. Why come all this way to teach in a one-room schoolhouse in a town that barely qualifies for the name?" Abigail stiffened. "Perhaps for the same reason you came west, Mr. Hartwell. For a fresh start." A muscle twitched in his jaw. "What are you running from?" "I could ask you the same question," she countered, then immediately regretted her boldness when his eyes darkened dangerously. "I'm not running," he said coldly. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." "As am I," she replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "Or I will be, once I reach Silver Creek." They stood in silence, the tension between them almost palpable, until Hank finally stepped aside. "Marshal Buford will be here this afternoon to take your statement," he said formally. "Dinner is at 6. Abigail nodded and moved past him, acutely aware of his presence as she slipped by. She couldn't explain the strange mixture of emotions he stirred in her: sympathy for his loss, admiration for the strength it must have taken to rebuild after such tragedy, and something else. Something unsettling that made her breath catch when their eyes met. It was foolishness, she told herself firmly as she retreated to the porch. She had her own ghosts to outrun, her own future to build. Getting entangled in Hank Hartwell's broken life was not part of her plan. But as she watched him stride across the yard, his tall figure silhouetted against the vast Montana sky, Abigail couldn't help but wonder what kind of man he had been before grief had hollowed him out, and if any part of that man still existed beneath the hard shell he presented to the world. The marshal's visit that afternoon was brief, but thorough. Bradford Buford was a lean, weathered man with sharp eyes that missed nothing as Abigail recounted the details of the robbery. He took careful notes, occasionally asking for clarification or additional information. "The man with the scarred hand, you're certain it was the right hand?" he questioned. "Yes, across the back of the hand, from the thumb to the little finger," Abigail confirmed. "I noticed it when he grabbed my reticule." The marshal nodded grimly. "That would be Jake Drummond. He and his brothers have been working this territory for months. With your testimony, we might finally have enough to bring them in." "Will I need to appear at a trial?" Abigail asked, concerned about her teaching duties. If we catch them, yes, Buford said honestly. But that might be a while yet. They're slippery customers, the Drummonds. He tucked his notebook away and stood. Meanwhile, you're safer here than anywhere else. Hartwell runs a tight operation, best security in the county, with his men patrolling the boundaries. After the marshal departed, Abigail found herself at loose ends. Her ankle was still too tender for much walking, but she was restless from inactivity. She spotted a bookshelf in the corner of the sitting room that she hadn't noticed before, and made her way over to investigate. Unlike the empty shelves in the study, these held a modest collection of well-worn volumes. She ran her fingers along the spines: Shakespeare, Dickens, Thoreau, Whitman. Not what she would have expected in a rancher's home, especially one as seemingly utilitarian as Hank Hartwell. "Sarah's books," came a voice from behind her, and Abigail turned to find Mrs. Peterson watching her with a sad smile. She was a great reader, taught at the school in Helena before she married Hank. He built those shelves for her as a wedding present. Abigail glanced back at the books with new understanding. He kept them all. Couldn't bear to part with them, though I don't think he's touched them since. Mrs. Peterson trailed off, then brightened artificially. "Would you like to borrow one? I'm sure Hank wouldn't mind." "I wouldn't want to presume," Abigail said hesitantly. Nonsense. Those books were meant to be read, not gathering dust. The housekeeper pulled out a volume of Tennyson's poetry. Sarah's favorite. She used to read aloud in the evenings, especially in winter when the days were short and the nights long. Abigail accepted the book carefully, imagining the dark-haired woman from the photograph reading by lamplight while a younger, happier Hank listened. It was difficult to reconcile that image with the grim, silent man she'd come to know. "Thank you," she said, tucking the book under her arm. "I'll be very careful with it." She spent the rest of the afternoon on the porch, lost in Tennyson's verses, occasionally glancing up to watch the ranch activities. Hank was nowhere to be seen, and she found herself both relieved and disappointed by his absence. Dinner that evening was a quiet affair. Hank ate mechanically, responding to Mrs. Peterson's cheerful chatter with monosyllables, while Abigail tried not to stare at the book she'd placed near her plate, suddenly worried he would see it and be angry at her presumption. Finally, when the meal was nearly over, he noticed the volume. His fork paused halfway to his mouth, and something flickered in his eyes. Pain, memory. She couldn't be sure. "I hope you don't mind," she said quickly. "Mrs. Peterson suggested I might borrow it. I should have asked you directly." Hank set down his fork, his face unreadable. "You like poetry, Miss Zimmerman?" "Very much," she admitted. "Tennyson especially. In Memoriam was a great comfort to me after my parents died." She hadn't meant to reveal that personal detail, but it slipped out naturally. Hank's eyes met hers, and for a brief moment, she glimpsed something in their blue depths that might have been recognition of shared pain, of understanding. "When did they pass?" he asked, his voice softer than she'd heard it before. "My father 6 years ago, of pneumonia. My mother followed 8 months later." Abigail swallowed hard. "The doctors called it heart failure, but I always believed it was grief." Hank nodded slowly. "The heart can fail in more ways than one," he said, and the raw honesty in his voice made her own heart ache. Before she could respond, he stood abruptly. "Take whatever books interest you. They're just gathering dust otherwise." He nodded to Mrs. Peterson. "Thank you for dinner." And then he was gone, leaving Abigail with the distinct impression that she'd glimpsed something precious and rare, a crack in the armor Hank Hartwell wore so rigidly. Later that night, unable to sleep, she sat by the window of her room, watching moonlight silver the landscape. The ranch was peaceful, the only sounds the occasional lowing of cattle in the distant pastures and the soft hoofbeats of the night watchman making his rounds. Movement near the barn caught her attention. A tall figure emerged, leading a horse, and even in the moonlight she recognized Hank's distinctive stride. He mounted smoothly and rode away from the ranch house, heading toward a rise to the east. Curious, Abigail watched until he disappeared over the crest of the hill. When he didn't return after an hour, she finally gave in to fatigue and crawled into bed, but her dreams were troubled visions of fire and loss, of a man riding endlessly across an empty landscape, searching for something forever beyond his reach. She woke to the sound of rain pattering against the window, the sky outside gray and heavy with clouds. Her ankle felt significantly better, and she tested it carefully as she dressed in the clean clothes Mrs. Peterson had somehow procured for her, a simple blue dress that fit reasonably well, if a bit loose in the waist. Downstairs, she found the housekeeper alone in the kitchen, kneading dough with more vigor than usual. "Good morning," Abigail said, helping herself to coffee. "Is everything all right? You seem concerned?" Mrs. Peterson sighed, blowing a strand of gray hair from her forehead. "Hank didn't come back last night. It's not unusual he sometimes stays out at the line shacks when he's checking the far pastures. But with this weather..." Abigail thought of the direction he'd ridden. "Does he have family buried here? On the property?" Mrs. Peterson looked up sharply. "How did you know that?" "I saw him ride out last night. The direction he took. It seemed purposeful." The housekeeper's hands stilled in the dough. "Yes," she said quietly. "Sarah and Jacob are buried under the oak tree on the East Hill. It's where they were married, where little Jacob took his first steps." She resumed kneading, her movements more gentle now. "He goes there sometimes, especially when something troubles him." Abigail felt a pang of guilt. Was it my borrowing the book? I didn't mean to upset him. "No, dear. If anything, it was seeing you reading it. Sarah loved those poems." Mrs. Peterson shaped the dough into a loaf and covered it with a cloth. "I think you remind him of things he's tried very hard to forget." "That I'm alive, you mean?" Abigail said softly. "While they're not. Perhaps. Or perhaps that life goes on, whether we wish it to or not." The housekeeper wiped her hands on her apron. "The Silver Creek School Board sent word. Mr. Collins will come for you tomorrow if the weather clears." Abigail felt an unexpected twinge of disappointment. "Oh, that's good. I should prepare my things." Before she could say more, the kitchen door burst open, and Will, the foreman, rushed in, rain dripping from his slicker. "Mrs. Peterson, Miss Zimmerman, is the boss back yet?" "No," Mrs. Peterson replied, alarmed by his urgency. "What's happened?" "Spotted riders near the north fence line, 3 of them, acting suspicious-like. Jenkins recognized one as matching the description of them stage robbers." Will glanced at Abigail. "Thought you should know, madam. Best stay inside today. Away from the windows. We're doubling the watch." Abigail's heart raced. "You think they've followed me here?" "Can't say for certain, but it seems likely. They might be worried about your testimony identifying them." Will grimaced. "Or they might just be looking for another easy target. Either way, we're not taking chances." After he left, Mrs. Peterson busied herself checking the locks on the doors and windows, her earlier concern for Hank now compounded by this new threat. "Should someone go look for Mr. Hartwell?" Abigail asked. "To warn him?" "Will's already sent 2 men," the housekeeper replied. "But in this weather, with the threat of those bandits, it complicates things." The day crawled by with agonizing slowness. Abigail tried to distract herself with books, but her mind kept returning to the danger that seemed to shadow her. By mid-afternoon, the rain had settled into a steady downpour, and there was still no sign of Hank. "This is my fault," she said, as she helped Mrs. Peterson prepare vegetables for dinner. "If I hadn't come here—" "Nonsense," the older woman interrupted firmly. "None of this is your doing. Those men are responsible for their own wickedness. And Hank..." She sighed. Hank's been riding out in all weather since he lost Sarah and Jacob. It's just his way. Before Abigail could respond, they heard the front door open and close. Both women froze, exchanging alarmed glances. "Stay here," Mrs. Peterson whispered, reaching for a heavy iron skillet. But before she could move, Hank appeared in the kitchen doorway, drenched to the skin, mud splattered up to his knees. His face was drawn with fatigue, but his eyes were alert and hard. "Will told me about the riders," he said without preamble. "Are you both all right?" "We're fine," Mrs. Peterson assured him, setting down the skillet with obvious relief. "But you look half drowned. Let me get you some dry clothes and hot coffee." He nodded distractedly, his gaze moving to Abigail. "They're after you," he said bluntly. "I found tracks leading from the main road straight to our north boundary." Abigail paled. "How can you be sure they're looking for me specifically?" "Because they passed at least 3 other ranches to get here," Hank replied. "And the tracks show they're being careful staying off the main trails, keeping to cover where they can." He ran a hand through his wet hair, leaving it standing in dark spikes. "My guess is they're worried about your testimony. You got a good look at them, including Drummond's distinctive scar." "What do we do?" Abigail asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "We get you to safety," Hank said simply. "As soon as the rain lets up enough for travel. Silver Creek is too obvious that's where they'll expect you to go. I know a place up in the high country where you can stay until the marshal tracks them down." "But I can't just hide indefinitely," Abigail protested. "I have responsibilities, a position waiting for me." "You can't teach if you're dead," Hank cut in harshly, then softened his tone at her shocked expression. "It wouldn't be indefinite, just until the immediate danger passes." Mrs. Peterson returned with dry clothes and a towel, which Hank accepted with a nod of thanks. "I'll change and then check in with the men," he said. "In the meantime, stay inside and away from the windows." After he left, Abigail sank into a chair, her legs suddenly weak. "I never thought... I knew testifying would be difficult, but I didn't expect them to come after me before they were even arrested." Mrs. Peterson patted her shoulder reassuringly. "Hank won't let anything happen to you. When he sets his mind to protecting something, nothing on God's green earth can stop him." "But I've already caused so much trouble," Abigail said miserably, "and now I'm putting everyone here at risk." "Trouble finds its way to our doorstep whether we invite it or not," the housekeeper said philosophically. "And as for risk, well, life out here is full of it. Always has been." When Hank returned an hour later, he looked marginally better in dry clothes, though the hard set of his jaw indicated the situation hadn't improved. "The rain's letting up," he announced, "but so is the light. We'll have to wait until morning to move you." He poured himself coffee and leaned against the counter, studying Abigail with an intensity that made her self-conscious. "Can you ride?" "Yes," she answered. "Not expertly, but I won't fall off." He nodded. "Good. We'll leave at first light. Pack only what you absolutely need. We'll be traveling light and fast." "We?" Abigail echoed. "Surely you don't need to come yourself? Couldn't one of your men—" "I know the mountains better than anyone," Hank interrupted. "And I'm the best shot on the ranch." His expression brooked no argument. "Will can handle things here for a few days." There was something in his manner, a restless energy, a burning intensity that hadn't been there before. It was as if the threat had awakened something in him, something that had lain dormant beneath the grief and emptiness. That night, Abigail found sleep elusive despite her exhaustion. The thought of being hunted was terrifying enough, but the prospect of days alone in the wilderness with Hank Hartwell brought its own kind of anxiety. There was something about him that unsettled her, not fear exactly, but a sense that he saw too much, challenged too much of what she thought she knew about herself. She had come west to escape her past, to build a new life free from the shadows that had haunted her in Boston. But as she finally drifted off to sleep, She couldn't shake the feeling that in Hank Hartwell, she had met someone who might understand those shadows all too well, and that recognition was both comforting and dangerous in ways she was only beginning to comprehend. Dawn broke misty and cool, the rain having passed in the night, leaving behind a freshly washed world that gleamed in the early light. Abigail dressed quickly in the practical riding clothes Mrs. Peterson had altered for her, a divided skirt and sturdy blouse that would allow her to ride astride comfortably. Her few belongings were packed in a small saddlebag, including the Tennyson volume she'd carefully wrapped to protect it from the elements. Hank was waiting in the kitchen, checking the loads in a pair of revolvers before holstering one and tucking the other into his saddlebags. A Winchester rifle leaned against the wall beside him. He glanced up as she entered, his eyes taking in her attire with approval. "Good," he said. "You'll be more comfortable riding that way. Mrs. Peterson's packed food for 3 days, though we shouldn't need that much." "Where exactly are we going?" Abigail asked as she accepted a cup of coffee and a plate of eggs from the housekeeper. "I have a hunting cabin about 15 miles into the mountains," Hank replied. "It's well hidden, defensible if need be. We'll stay there until I get word from the marshal that it's safe to return." "And if they follow us?" His expression hardened. "They won't. But if they try, I'll handle it." There was a lethal certainty in his voice that reminded her that beneath the civilized rancher was a man who had survived the harshest realities of the frontier. It should have frightened her, this glimpse of ruthless capability, but instead, she found it oddly reassuring. They set out as the sun cleared the eastern hills, taking a route that led them away from the main trails, skirting the edges of the ranch property before climbing into the foothills. Hank set a steady pace, not too fast, occasionally glancing back to check on her. "How's the ankle?" he asked during one such pause. "Holding up fine," Abigail assured him. She'd wrapped it tightly as the doctor had instructed, and while it was tender, the pain was manageable. They rode mostly in silence, Hank clearly alert for any sign of pursuit or danger. By midday, they had climbed high enough that Abigail could look back and see the vast expanse of the Double H spread out below them like a patchwork quilt: pastures, woodlands, the cluster of buildings that made up the ranch headquarters. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "You've built something remarkable." Hank followed her gaze, his expression unreadable. "It was Sarah's dream," he said after a long moment. "A place of our own, land that would pass to our children and their children after them." His voice caught slightly on the word children, a tiny crack in his composure that he quickly masked. After they were gone, building it up seemed like the only thing left to do. "To honor their memory," Abigail suggested gently. He shrugged, the gesture somehow conveying both agreement and dismissal of sentiment. "We should keep moving. There's a stream up ahead where we can rest the horses and eat something." The stream was a clear, rushing ribbon of water cutting through a small meadow dotted with late summer wildflowers. While the horses drank, Hank spread a blanket in the shade of a pine tree and unpacked bread, cheese, and cold chicken that Mrs. Peterson had prepared. As they ate, Abigail found herself studying him when he wasn't looking, the strong, clean lines of his profile, the competent way his hands moved as he sliced bread and checked his weapons, the watchful alertness that never seemed to leave him even in this peaceful setting. "You haven't asked why I left Boston," she said suddenly. Hank looked up, surprised by the non sequitur. "You said you wanted a fresh start." "Yes, but you don't seem the type to accept such a vague answer." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "I figured you'd tell me if you wanted me to know." Abigail toyed with a blade of grass, suddenly uncertain why she'd brought it up. "I was engaged," she said finally, "to the son of one of Boston's most prominent families. It was considered quite a coup for a teacher of modest background to make such a match." She could feel Hank watching her, waiting for her to continue. "Charles was charming, well-educated, everything a young woman is taught to want in a husband. But there were incidents. Temper." Jealousy. She twisted the grass between her fingers. The first time he struck me, I told myself it was an aberration. The second time, I began to have doubts. The third time, I knew I had to leave. Did you? Hank asked quietly. Not immediately, she admitted. His family had influence. They'd made it clear they could ensure I never taught in Boston again if I broke the engagement. And part of me still hoped he could change. She sighed. Then I saw the advertisement for Silver Creek. A new place, far away, where no one knew me or Charles or his family. It seemed like Providence. He let you go? Hank's voice held a note of skepticism. Not willingly, Abigail said, meeting his gaze steadily. I left in the night, took only what I could carry, used my savings to book passage west. As far as I know, he still doesn't know exactly where I've gone, just that I headed west. Hank's expression darkened. If he finds out, he won't, she said quickly. Boston is a world away from Montana territory. And even if he did somehow learn where I am, Charles is many things, but a man willing to endure the discomforts and dangers of frontier life isn't one of them. Hank was silent for a long moment, his eyes never leaving her face. You're braver than you give yourself credit for, he said finally, walking away from everything you knew, starting over in a place like this. Or more desperate, she countered with a wry smile. Sometimes they're the same thing. He began packing up their lunch. We should move on. I want to reach the cabin before dark. As they rode higher into the mountains, the landscape grew more dramatic, towering pines, granite outcroppings, glimpses of snow-capped peaks in the distance. The air was cooler here, tinged with the scent of pine and wild herbs. Do you come here often? Abigail asked as they navigated a particularly steep stretch of trail. Not anymore, Hank replied. I built the cabin when I first came to Montana, before I had the ranch. Used to hunt and trap in these mountains during the winters. He glanced back at her. Sarah hated it up here, said it was too lonely, too wild. She never understood why I kept the place after we married. And why did you? He was silent so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Everyone needs somewhere they can go when the world gets too loud, he said finally. Somewhere they can hear themselves think. It was perhaps the most revealing thing he'd said about himself, and Abigail found herself wondering what thoughts Hank Hartwell needed solitude to hear, and whether they brought him comfort or more pain. The cabin appeared suddenly as they rounded a bend in the trail, a solid structure of logs and stone nestled against the mountainside, partially hidden by a stand of pines. It was larger than she'd expected, with a covered porch and what looked like a well-built corral for horses. It's charming, she said, genuinely impressed. Much more substantial than I imagined. Built to withstand mountain winters, Hank explained as he dismounted and came to help her down. His hands were strong and warm on her waist, lifting her easily from the saddle. For a brief moment they stood close enough that she could feel the heat of his body, see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, smell the clean scent of his skin beneath the dust of the trail. He stepped back abruptly, as if suddenly aware of their proximity. I'll see to the horses. The door should be unlocked. Inside, the cabin was simple but comfortable, one large room with a stone fireplace, a sturdy table with chairs, a curtained-off sleeping area, and basic cooking facilities. Everything was dusty but otherwise well-maintained, as if Hank had indeed stopped using the place but couldn't bring himself to abandon it entirely. Abigail opened windows to air out the musty smell, then found a broom and began sweeping while she waited for Hank to return. By the time he entered with their saddlebags, she had cleared away the worst of the dust and cobwebs. You didn't need to do that, he said, setting down their belongings. I don't mind. It feels good to be useful. She leaned the broom against the wall. Though, I must admit, I'm surprised by how comfortable this place is. I was expecting something much more, Primitive. I lived here for 2 years before I had enough money to buy the ranch, Hank explained, moving to the fireplace to build a fire against the evening chill. Made it as comfortable as I could. As he worked, Abigail explored the cabin more thoroughly. On a shelf near the sleeping area, she found a few books, practical guides to hunting and trapping, but also, surprisingly, a well-worn copy of Thoreau's Walden. She picked it up, leafing through pages marked with notes in a strong masculine hand. "You've read this thoroughly," she observed. Hank glanced up from the fire. "It made sense to me when I first came west. The idea of stripping life down to its essentials, finding truth in solitude and nature. I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately," Abigail quoted softly. "To front only the essential facts of life," Hank continued, surprising her, "and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived." Their eyes met across the room, and Abigail felt something shift between them, a recognition, perhaps, of unexpected common ground. "Do you think you've found it?" she asked. "The essential truth Thoreau was seeking?" Hank turned back to the fire, adding another log. "I thought I had once," he said quietly, "with Sarah and Jacob. A simple truth. Love, family, building something together." He stood, brushing his hands on his jeans. "After they died, I stopped looking for meaning, just focused on surviving each day." The raw honesty in his voice touched something deep inside her. "And now?" He didn't answer directly. Instead, he moved to the window, gazing out at the gathering dusk. "We should be safe here. I'll take first watch tonight, just in case, but I doubt anyone could have followed our trail." Abigail recognized the deliberate change of subject but didn't press. Instead, she set about helping prepare a simple meal from the supplies Mrs. Peterson had packed. They ate mostly in silence, but it wasn't the uncomfortable silence of strangers, rather. It held the quality of shared understanding, of things acknowledged without needing to be spoken aloud. After dinner, Hank took blankets and stepped outside to keep watch from the porch, leaving Abigail to take the cabin's single bed. She lay awake for a long time, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the mountain night, the whisper of wind through pines, the occasional call of an owl, the distant howl of a wolf. And beneath those sounds, the steady presence of Hank Hartwell just beyond the door, a man who had lost everything and yet still found the capacity to protect a woman he barely knew. A man who quoted Thoreau and kept his dead wife's books as if they were sacred relics. A man whose grief had hollowed him out, but not destroyed the fundamental decency at his core. As sleep finally claimed her, Abigail's last thought was that perhaps Charles had done her a favor in the end, driving her away from Boston, away from the stifling expectations of society, into this wild country where men like Hank Hartwell made their own rules and lived by their own code. She woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of quiet movement. Opening her eyes, she found Hank at the small stove, his back to her, as he prepared breakfast. Morning light streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air. "Good morning," she said, sitting up and smoothing her hair. He turned, coffee pot in hand. "Morning. Sleep all right?" "Better than I expected," she admitted. "And you? Did you sleep at all?" "Some." He poured coffee into 2 tin cups. "No sign of trouble. I think we lost them completely." Abigail accepted the cup he offered, cradling it in her hands for warmth. "What now?" "We wait," Hank said simply. "I sent a message to Marshal Buford before we left, letting him know where we'd be. Once he tracks down the Drummonds, he'll send word." He set a plate of bacon and biscuits on the table. "Could be a day, could be several. We have supplies enough." The prospect of days alone with Hank in this isolated cabin should have made her nervous. But strangely, Abigail felt more at ease than she had in months. Perhaps it was the distance from her old life, or the simple clarity of their situation a refuge from danger. Nothing more. After breakfast, she insisted on washing the dishes while Hank checked the perimeter of the cabin. When he returned, he found her on the porch, gazing out at the spectacular view of forested slopes falling away to the valley below. "It's breathtaking," she said as he joined her. "I can see why you love it here." Hank leaned against the porch railing, his eyes scanning the horizon. "It's peaceful, uncomplicated." "Is that what you want? An uncomplicated life?" He glanced at her, a flicker of something amusement, perhaps crossing his face. "Isn't that what everyone wants?" "I don't know," Abigail said thoughtfully. "I think sometimes the complications are what make life rich. Connections with others, the messiness of human relationships, they're difficult, but also necessary." "Necessary for what?" "For feeling alive," she said simply. Hank was silent for a long moment, his profile strong against the backdrop of mountains. "And do you feel alive, Miss Zimmerman?" "I'm beginning to," she answered honestly. "More than I have in a very long time." His eyes met hers, and something passed between them, a current of understanding, of shared experience despite their different paths. Then he looked away, back to the mountains. But Abigail sensed that something had shifted. A barrier lowered just slightly. The day passed in a strange, peaceful rhythm. Hank showed her how to use the Winchester in case of emergency, his hands steady as he guided hers on the weapon. They walked a short trail that circled the cabin, Hank pointing out tracks and signs of wildlife that Abigail would have missed entirely. In the afternoon, they sat on the porch reading, Abigail with her Tennyson, Hank with an old newspaper he'd found in the cabin. It was the most relaxed she'd seen him, though he still maintained a watchful vigilance, regularly scanning their surroundings for any sign of threat. But there were moments when the hardness left his face, when a hint of the man he'd been before tragedy struck showed through, particularly when she managed to make him smile, a rare occurrence that transformed his features. "Do you miss teaching?" he asked unexpectedly as the afternoon light began to fade. Abigail looked up from her book, surprised by the personal question. "Very much," she admitted. "There's something wonderful about watching a child grasp a new concept, seeing that moment of understanding dawn in their eyes." "Sarah felt the same way," Hank said quietly. "She taught our neighbors' children sometimes, here at the ranch. Said she was born to it." He paused. "She would have been pleased about the school in Silver Creek. She always said these territories needed education as much as they needed law and order." "She sounds like a remarkable woman." "She was." His voice was soft with memory. Strong, determined, never took no for an answer. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "She's the one who decided we should marry, you know. I was too scared to ask sure she'd say no to a rough trapper with nothing to offer but dreams. So she proposed to me instead, said she was tired of waiting for me to find my courage." Abigail laughed, delighted by this glimpse of the woman who had captured Hank's heart. "I think I would have liked her very much." "She would have liked you too," Hank said, and the simple statement sent a warm glow through Abigail's chest. That evening, as they sat by the fire after dinner, the comfortable silence between them was broken by a sound that made them both freeze, the distant but unmistakable noise of horses approaching. Hank was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand. "Stay inside," he ordered, moving to the window with fluid grace, away from the light. Abigail's heart pounded as she retreated to the shadows, watching as Hank extinguished all but one lamp, then positioned himself where he could see the trail leading to the cabin. "3 riders," he reported in a low voice, "moving slow, like they're searching." His expression hardened. "It's them. I recognize the description of the horses from the marshal's bulletin." Fear closed Abigail's throat. "How did they find us?" "Doesn't matter now." Hank checked his rifle, then handed her one of his revolvers. "Take this. If anything happens to me, barricade yourself in and don't open the door for anyone but the marshal." "Hank," she began, but he cut her off. "I'm going to circle around behind them. Might be able to pick them off before they reach the cabin." His eyes met hers, intense and determined. "Stay put. Promise me." She nodded, clutching the revolver with trembling hands. "Be careful," she whispered. He held her gaze for a heartbeat longer, then slipped out the door like a shadow, disappearing into the gathering darkness. Left alone, Abigail fought to control her breathing, to still the trembling in her limbs. The weight of the revolver was unfamiliar, frightening in its lethal purpose, but she steeled herself to use it if necessary. She would not be a victim again, not of Charles, not of these bandits. Time stretched endlessly as she waited, every sense strained for any sound of conflict. The fire crackled in the hearth. Wind whispered through the pines outside, but of Hank or the approaching riders, she heard nothing. Then, suddenly, gunfire erupted, a rapid exchange of shots that seemed to come from all directions. Abigail flinched at each report, her imagination painting terrible pictures of Hank wounded or worse. More shots, a shout of pain, then silence. Abigail held her breath. The revolver clutched tightly in both hands as she stared at the door, ready to defend herself if necessary. Footsteps on the porch, then Hank's voice, low and urgent. "Abigail, it's me. Open up." She rushed to the door, relief flooding through her as she unbarred it to find Hank standing there, alive and apparently unhurt, though his face was grim. "Are you all right?" she asked, scanning him for injuries. "Fine," he answered tersely. "Got one of them. The other two fled, but they'll be back with reinforcements. We need to move. Now." "Move where?" Abigail asked, already gathering her things. "If they found us here." "I know a place," Hank interrupted. "An old mining cabin deeper in the mountains. It's abandoned, barely standing, but they won't think to look there." He was checking his rifle as he spoke, reloading with quick, practiced movements. "Pack only what you need. We're traveling light and fast." Within minutes, they had saddled the horses and were moving deeper into the mountains, following game trails invisible to Abigail's untrained eye. Hank led the way, alert for pursuit, occasionally doubling back or taking seemingly random turns to confuse their trail. The night was clear but moonless, making the going treacherous. Abigail clung to her saddle, trusting her horse to follow Hank's mount through the darkness. Despite the danger, or perhaps because of it, she felt strangely exhilarated, more alive than she had in years. They rode for what seemed like hours, climbing steadily higher into the mountains. Finally, when Abigail's muscles were screaming with fatigue and the eastern sky was beginning to lighten with the first hint of dawn, Hank called a halt. "We'll rest here for a bit," he said, helping her dismount. "Let the horses recover." "Where are we?" Abigail asked, looking around at the rocky clearing surrounded by dense pines. "About 5 miles from the mining cabin," Hank replied, spreading a blanket for her on a relatively flat patch of ground. "But we've covered our tracks well. Even if they pick up our trail, it will take them time to follow it this far." Exhausted, Abigail sank onto the blanket gratefully. Hank brought her water and some jerky from his saddlebags, then settled nearby, his rifle across his knees. "You should rest," she told him. "You haven't slept properly in days." "I'll sleep when we're safe," he said, but his voice was weary, and she could see the fatigue etched in the lines of his face. "At least sit beside me," she insisted. "Share the blanket. It's cold." After a moment's hesitation, he moved to sit beside her, their shoulders almost touching. The simple human contact was comforting, and Abigail found herself leaning slightly into his solid warmth. "Thank you," she said softly, "for all of this. For risking your life for mine." Hank was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't respond. Then, almost too quietly to hear, You make me remember what it feels like. What, what feels like? Caring whether someone lives or dies, he said simply. It's been a long time. The raw honesty in his voice made Abigail's heart ache. Impulsively, she reached out and took his hand, her fingers curling around his. He tensed for a moment, then slowly relaxed, allowing the contact. I'm sorry, she whispered, for what you've lost, for the pain you've carried. He didn't pull away, and in the growing light of dawn she could see his profile strong, weathered, marked by grief, but not destroyed by it. When Sarah and Jacob died, he said after a long silence, I wanted to die too, considered it more than once. His hand tightened slightly on hers. The only thing that stopped me was knowing how angry Sarah would be if I gave up. So I kept going, built the ranch like we'd planned, but I wasn't really living, just existing. Abigail squeezed his hand gently, encouraging him to continue. I didn't think I'd ever feel anything again, he admitted. Not pain, not joy, nothing. It seems safer that way. And now? She asked softly. He turned to look at her, his blue eyes clear in the dawn light. Now I'm not so sure, he said. Since you arrived. It's like something's waking up inside me. And it hurts, Abigail. God, it hurts. The use of her first name, the vulnerability in his voice, it undid something in her, broke through the careful walls she'd built around her own heart. Before she could think better of it, she leaned forward and pressed her lips gently to his. For a heartbeat, he remained still, unresponsive. Then, with a sound low in his throat, half groan, half sigh, he kissed her back, his free hand coming up to cradle her face with surprising tenderness. When they finally broke apart, both breathing unevenly, Hank rested his forehead against hers. This is madness, he murmured. You're leaving for Silver Creek as soon as it's safe. I have the ranch. We barely know each other. I know enough, Abigail whispered. I know you're a good man, an honorable man. I know you've suffered and survived. I know when I'm with you, I feel safe for the first time in years. He drew back slightly to search her face. And what about your teaching position? Your fresh start? Silver Creek is only 20 miles from your ranch, she reminded him. Not so far. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. No, not so far at all. The moment was interrupted by the sound of a distant gunshot. They both tensed, instantly alert. That came from the direction of my cabin, Hank said grimly, rising to his feet and pulling Abigail up with him. They must have circled back, hoping to find us there. Will they be able to track us from there? Eventually, if they're skilled enough. He was already gathering their things, preparing to move out. But we have a head start, and I know these mountains better than they do. They mounted quickly and continued their journey, the brief interlude of connection now overshadowed by the renewed threat. But something had changed between them, a current of awareness that hummed beneath the tension of their situation. The old mining cabin proved to be little more than a shack, half collapsed and long abandoned, but its very dilapidation made it an unlikely hiding place. Hank concealed their horses in a thicket behind the structure, then led Abigail inside, checking carefully for dangers like rotted floorboards or unstable walls. Not exactly comfortable, he acknowledged, clearing debris from a corner where they could sit, but it should serve for a day or two. It's perfect, Abigail assured him, though in truth the musty, decaying space was far from inviting. No one would think to look here. Hank secured the door as best he could, then positioned himself near the single grimy window where he could watch the approach. You should rest, he told her. I'll keep watch. You need sleep too, she insisted. You're no good to either of us if you collapse from exhaustion. After some argument, he agreed to take turns watching. Abigail took the first shift, sitting by the window with the revolver while Hank stretched out on the blanket they'd spread over the rough wooden floor. Despite his protests that he was too on edge to sleep, Exhaustion claimed him quickly. Abigail watched as his features relaxed in slumber, the hard lines of worry and vigilance softening, making him look younger, more vulnerable. What would it be like, she wondered, to build a life with such a man? A man shaped by loss and hardship, yet still capable of tenderness, of protection, of the kind of kiss that had made her feel both weak and stronger than she'd ever been. The day passed in tense waiting, both of them alert for any sign of pursuit. By evening, when no danger had materialized, they cautiously began to hope that they had successfully evaded the Drummonds. "We'll wait one more day," Hank decided as they shared a meager dinner of jerky and hardtack. "If there's no sign of them by tomorrow night, we'll risk heading back toward the ranch." That night, with the temperature dropping sharply, they huddled together for warmth, the small physical distance between them finally erased by practical necessity. Abigail lay with her head on Hank's chest, his arm around her shoulders, their bodies sharing heat beneath the blankets. "Tell me about Boston," Hank said softly in the darkness. "What you miss, what you don't." Abigail smiled against his shirt. "I miss libraries, hot baths, concerts sometimes." She thought for a moment. "I don't miss the pretense, the constant worry about appearances and reputation, the feeling of being watched and judged at every turn." "And Charles?" Hank's voice was carefully neutral, but she could feel the tension in his body. "I don't miss Charles," she said firmly. "I miss who I thought he was when we first met, charming, intelligent, passionate about ideas. But that wasn't the real man." Hank's arm tightened around her slightly. "If he ever comes looking for you—" "He won't," Abigail interrupted. "But if by some remote chance he did, I wouldn't go with him. Not for anything." She lifted her head to look at Hank in the dim moonlight filtering through the broken window. "I've found something better here. Something real." The next morning dawned clear and crisp, with a hint of autumn in the air. They were sharing the last of their coffee when Hank suddenly stiffened, his head turning toward the window. "Someone's coming," he said quietly, reaching for his rifle. "Single rider, moving fast." Abigail's heart raced as she took up position behind him, the revolver ready in her hand. They waited in tense silence as the sound of hoofbeats grew closer, then stopped just outside the cabin. "Hartwell, you in there?" called a familiar voice. "It's Marshal Buford." Hank let out a breath of relief, though he didn't lower his rifle as he moved to the door. "That you, Bradford?" "In the flesh," came the reply. "And alone. We got 'em, Hank. All 3 Drummonds, rounded up yesterday trying to rob the bank in Silver Creek, of all the fool things." Hank opened the door to reveal the marshal, dusty from hard riding but grinning broadly. "Thought you'd want to know right away. Figured you might be getting tired of hiding out with the schoolmarm." Abigail stepped forward, still holding the revolver. "You're certain they're all in custody?" "Yes, madam," Buford confirmed. "Locked up tight in my jail, with extra deputies watching 'em round the clock until the circuit judge arrives next week." He eyed the dilapidated cabin. "Looks like you two have been roughing it." "We've managed," Hank said dryly. "How'd you find us?" "Ran into Will and some of your boys searching for you. They said you might head for the old mining claims if your cabin wasn't safe." The marshal dismounted. "I've got food and fresh water if you need it. Figure we can all ride back together." The return journey to the Double H Ranch was uneventful, though Abigail found herself increasingly aware of a growing sense of uncertainty. With the danger past, what would happen between her and Hank? Was their connection merely a product of shared danger, of forced proximity? As they rode side by side, she stole glances at his profile, trying to read his thoughts. He seemed preoccupied, answering the marshal's conversation in monosyllables, his eyes constantly scanning the landscape as if still expecting trouble. When they finally crested the rise overlooking the ranch, Hank reined in his horse, gazing down at the buildings below. "Home," he said, and something in his voice made Abigail's heart constrict. "Miss Zimmerman," Marshal Buford said, "the Silver Creek School Board has been asking after you daily. With the Drummonds locked up, there's no reason you can't take up your position immediately. I'd be happy to escort you there tomorrow, if you're willing." Before she could answer, Hank spoke. "Let her rest a day or two, Bradford. She's been through enough." The marshal nodded. "Of course. Just passing along the message." He glanced between them with shrewd eyes. "I'll head back to town now. Let folks know you're both safe. Miss Zimmerman, I'll need you to come in and make a formal statement before the judge arrives." After Buford departed, Hank and Abigail continued down to the ranch in silence. Mrs. Carsey Peterson greeted them with tears of joy and immediate preparations for baths and a proper meal. In the flurry of activity, there was no opportunity for private conversation, and Abigail found herself whisked away to the guest room before she could speak to Hank alone. That evening, freshly bathed and dressed in clean clothes, she joined Hank and Mrs. Peterson for dinner. The housekeeper chattered happily, filling them in on ranch happenings during their absence, while Hank ate silently, responding when directly addressed but otherwise lost in thought. After Mrs. Peterson retired for the night, Abigail followed Hank to the porch, where he stood looking out at the star-filled sky. "I suppose I should leave for Silver Creek tomorrow," she said quietly. He turned to face her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "Is that what you want?" "I made a commitment," she replied carefully. "Those children are expecting a teacher." Hank nodded slowly. "Of course. I'll have Will drive you in the wagon." Disappointment settled in Abigail's chest. What had she expected? Declarations of love? Proposals of marriage? They had shared danger, comfort. One kiss hardly the foundation for life-changing decisions. "Thank you," she said formally, "for everything you've done. I wouldn't be alive, if not for you." Hank took a step toward her. "Abigail." "It's all right," she interrupted, unable to bear what she feared would be kind but firm rejection. "What happened in the mountains? I understand it was extraordinary circumstances. You don't owe me anything." "Is that what you think?" he asked, his voice low and intense. "That I kissed you out of some sense of obligation? Or fear? Or loneliness?" "I don't know what to think," she admitted. "I only know that I care for you, more than I should after so short an acquaintance. And the thought of going to Silver Creek tomorrow and perhaps never seeing you again." Her voice caught. In two strides, Hank closed the distance between them, his hands coming up to frame her face. "I've spent 3 years dead inside," he said roughly. "Then you arrived, with your courage and your stubbornness and your green eyes that see too much. And suddenly I'm feeling everything again. It terrifies me, Abigail. But the thought of losing you terrifies me more." "What are you saying?" she whispered. "I'm saying I don't want you to go to Silver Creek. Not yet." His thumbs brushed gently over her cheeks. "Stay. Get to know me. Let me get to know you, in safety and peace. See if what we felt in the mountains can grow into something lasting." Joy bloomed in Abigail's chest. "And the children waiting for their teacher?" "Silver Creek can wait another week or two for their schoolmarm," Hank said, a smile finally breaking through the seriousness of his expression. "I'm not suggesting you abandon your position, just delay it a little. Give us time." "Time," she repeated, her own smile growing. "Yes, I think we deserve that." When he kissed her this time, there was no hesitation, no uncertainty, only the sweet certainty of two people who had found in each other something worth fighting for, worth living for. 2 weeks later, Abigail stood on the porch of the Silver Creek schoolhouse, watching as children filed in for their first day of lessons. She had arrived in town the previous day, taking up residence in the small but comfortable quarters attached to the school building. The school board had been understanding about her delay, especially given the dramatic circumstances, And if there were whispers about the time she'd spent at the Double H Ranch, they were largely overshadowed by the more exciting gossip about the Drummond gang's capture and upcoming trial. As the last child entered the building, Abigail turned to find Hank watching from astride his horse, a rare smile softening his features. "Nervous?" he asked. "A little," she admitted, "but mostly excited." "You'll be wonderful," he said confidently. "Those kids don't know how lucky they are." During the past 2 weeks, they had carefully built the foundation of something neither had expected to find again: trust, companionship, the beginnings of love. Hank had spoken more of Sarah and Jacob, sharing memories that brought both pain and healing. Abigail had confided her fears about Charles, about failing in her new position, about opening her heart after being hurt. And gradually, day by day, the walls between them had lowered. "Will I see you tonight?" she asked. "Wild horses couldn't keep me away," Hank promised. "I'll be here after your last class." He hesitated, then added softly, "I have something to ask you." Abigail's heart skipped a beat. "Should I be prepared for this question?" "Just be yourself," he said. "That's all I've ever wanted." As she watched him ride away, Abigail felt a sense of rightness, of belonging, that she had never experienced before, not in Boston, not in her parents' home, nowhere until now. Whatever question Hank planned to ask her that evening, she already knew her answer would be yes, because somehow, against all odds, they had both found their way back from the darkness, she, from fear and control, he, from grief and emptiness, into something neither had dared hope for: a second chance, a new beginning, a heart once dead, now painfully, gloriously alive. And as Abigail turned to enter the schoolhouse and begin her first day as teacher, she carried with her the knowledge that 20 miles away, across the rolling Montana rangeland, waited a man and a home and a future brighter than any she could have imagined when she first set out from Boston in search of a new life. A future that had begun with danger but would continue in love, built day by day, memory by memory, until the pain of the past was balanced, not erased. Never that, but balanced by the joy of what was yet to come.